Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Share where you are watching from, because today we will explore together the dark secrets of the mountains of Kentucky. A story that blends hospitality, mystery, and discoveries that have haunted an entire community for decades. In 1843, Kentucky was still a land where roads were narrow trails winding between hills covered with oak and hickory trees. The Appalachian Mountains stood as silent guardians over small villages that survived on tobacco farming and cattle ranching. It was a time when travel meant relying on the kindness of strangers, especially as the shadows of night began to stretch across the valleys. In Harlan County, right in the heart of this mountainous region, there was an estate known among merchants and travelers. It was a sturdy wooden hut, built in a clearing surrounded by ancient pine trees, where two sisters offered lodging and meals to those crossing those inhospitable lands. Their names were Sarah and Martha Henley, women who appeared to be between 40 and 50 years old, always dressed in dark clothes, with smiles that never reached their eyes. The property was strategically located at an important crossroads. On one side, the trail connecting Louisville to the small mining towns of the east. On the other, the path leading merchants to the tobacco plantations of Tennessee. For any traveler passing at dusk, the yellowish light in the windows of the Henley sisters' cabin meant salvation. A place to rest, eat, and regain strength before continuing the journey. Records from that era, preserved in the Harlan County archives, show the region was known for its rough but genuine hospitality. Mountain families had the custom of welcoming strangers, offering what they had in exchange for news from the outside world and a few coins. It was a tradition dating back to the first settlers, an informal support network that made life in those isolated mountains possible. Sarah, according to the few reports that have reached us, was described as a tall, thin woman with gray hair always tied in a tight bun. Martha, the younger, had a more robust build and spoke little, limiting herself to nodding when guests arrived. Both were widows, they told visitors, and had inherited the property from a brother who died years earlier during a cholera epidemic. The hut itself was a typical example of rural Kentucky architecture. Walls of notched logs, a wooden shingle roof, a stone chimney that constantly emitted smoke during the cold months. Outside, a small stable could accommodate up to 6 horses, and there was always a pile of cut wood ready to be burned. The interior was simple but clean, with a long oak table where guests ate their meals and a few small rooms in the back. What made the Henley sisters' inn special wasn't just the lodging, but the food. Travelers who passed by returned to their hometowns, talking about the extraordinary meals they received in that lost hut amidst the mountains. Hearty stews that warmed the body on freezing winter nights. Fresh breads coming out of the oven with that unmistakable aroma of homemade yeast. Meats prepared with unidentifiable seasonings that left a striking flavor in the memory. It was this very reputation that attracted more and more travelers to the sisters' estate. Merchants who regularly traveled the route even altered their paths just to spend a night at the Harlan County cabin. Some told stories about how Sarah and Martha managed to prepare hearty meals even during periods of scarcity in the region, as if they had a secret supply source that never ran out. But there was something more to these stories, something that started as discreet murmurs among the travelers themselves and over time turned into growing unease. Some guests mentioned strange dreams during their nights in the cabin. Others spoke of noises coming from some undefined part of the property after everyone had retired. And there were those who swore they heard whispered conversations between the sisters, always at unusual times in the early morning. The Kentucky of 1843 was a land where superstition and reality blended easily. The mountains held ancient secrets, and families living in isolation developed peculiar customs for survival. In this context, the Henley sisters seemed like just another local eccentricity, until certain details began to form a disturbing pattern that could no longer be ignored. The first sign that something was wrong came in the fall of 1843 when a tool dealer named William Tucker arrived in the town of Pineville with an unsettling tale. Tucker was known in the region as a reliable man who had worked the same trade route for over 15 years. He knew every trail, every family, every inn between Louisville and the eastern mountains. That October morning, Tucker showed up at the local sheriff's office with a pale face and trembling hands. He said he had spent 3 nights at the Henley sisters' cabin and witnessed something he couldn't get out of his head. During his stay, on the second night, another traveler arrived, a young man appearing to be about 25 years old, who introduced himself as Samuel Morrison and said he was heading to Cumberland Gap, looking for work in the coal mines. Morrison seemed an ordinary fellow, the kind constantly seen on Kentucky's roads at that time. He carried a small bundle with his belongings and had that reserved manner typical of someone away from home for the first time. The sisters received him with the same discreet hospitality as always, offering him a place at the table and a corner to sleep. What disturbed William Tucker wasn't what he saw, but what he didn't see. The next morning, when he woke before dawn to continue his journey, Samuel Morrison had simply vanished. His bundle was no longer in the corner where he had left it. There was no trace of his passage, and when Tucker asked the sisters about the young man's whereabouts, they replied with an eerie silence before Martha muttered something about him leaving too early, while it was still dark. But the disappearance wasn't the only thing bothering Tucker. It was the aroma coming from the kitchen that morning, a smell of cooking meat that seemed more intense than usual, mixed with herbs he couldn't identify. And there was something else. During the night, Tucker swore he heard noises coming from somewhere near the cabin. Noises that sounded like someone digging dirt, accompanied by whispered conversations between the sisters. The sheriff of Pineville, a pragmatic man named James Butler, listened to Tucker's account with initial skepticism. Travelers disappeared frequently back then, especially young men seeking opportunities in the mining regions. The roads were dangerous, there were wild animals, and it wasn't uncommon for someone to get lost on the confusing mountain trails. Besides, the Henley sisters enjoyed a good reputation in the local community. But Tucker insisted something was wrong. He said that over his 15 years on that route, he had stayed at the sisters' hut more than 20 times. He had always noticed an odd abundance of fresh meat available, even during harsh winters when game was scarce. And there was another thing that intrigued him. He had never seen the sisters slaughter animals on the property, nor were there any pens or pigsties to justify the amount of meat they served to guests. Sheriff Butler decided to conduct some low-key investigations. He spoke with other merchants who frequented the route and discovered a disturbing pattern. In the past 2 years, at least 6 people had last been seen in the area where the Henley sisters' cabin stood. They were all young men traveling alone with no family in the region to search for them when they disappeared. Among the missing was Jonathan Hartwell, a 22-year-old who had left Lexington for the Harlan coal mines. His last correspondence to the family mentioned he planned to stop at a mountain inn. There was also Michael O'Brien, a 28-year-old Irish immigrant who worked as a peddler, selling household goods from farm to farm. Witnesses last saw him buying supplies at a Pineville store, saying he intended to spend the night at a cabin he'd seen on a previous trip. Most intriguing was the case of Robert Carlyle, the son of a respectable Frankfort family. Carlyle had disappeared 3 months earlier during a business trip. Unlike the others, he carried a considerable amount of money and jewelry. When his horse was found wandering loose near the sisters' property, they explained to a farmer that they had found it, that a traveler had passed through a few days prior, but left early, leaving the animal loosely tied. Butler began to realize there was a method in the victim selection. All were young men traveling alone, without strong local connections that could prompt immediate searches. They were the kind of people who could vanish without causing a major stir, especially at a time when communications were slow and authorities limited. But concrete evidence was still lacking. The Henley sisters were respected citizens, had never been in trouble with the law, and their establishment was seen as a valuable service to the community. Accusing two elderly women of such serious crimes based solely on coincidences and suspicions could be dangerous for any sheriff's career. It was then that information fell into Butler's hands that would completely change the course of the investigation. One of the men working on road maintenance in the area had made a disturbing discovery in a wooded area near the sisters' property. Something buried not too deep, which the weather and autumn rains had begun to expose. Thomas Whitfield was a simple man who made his living repairing bridges and keeping trails passable between counties. In November of 1843, he was working on a section of road, passing about half a mile from the Henley sisters' property. It was routine work, removing fallen branches and rocks blocking cart passage. As he dug to drain a rain-soaked patch, Whitfield noticed the soil there looked different, looser, as if it had been recently disturbed. As he dug deeper, his shovel hit something solid. At first he thought it was a rock, but when he started removing the surrounding earth, he discovered it was an object that shouldn't be there. It was a small trunk made of dark wood with iron locks beginning to rust. Whitfield looked around, checking if he was alone, before carefully opening the container. Inside he found a disturbing collection of personal belongings. There were leather wallets with documents, rings, pocket watches, coins, and personal letters. All the items appeared to have belonged to different men, and some names on the documents matched those reported missing. Among the objects was a letter addressed to Jonathan Hartwell, the 22-year-old who had left Lexington months earlier. There was also a silver watch with the initials M.O. engraved on the cover, which could have belonged to Michael O'Brien, the Irish peddler. Most unsettling was a ring bearing the Carlisle family crest, which certainly belonged to Robert, the Frankfurt merchant whose horse had been found wandering near the sisters' cabin. Whitfield immediately grasped the gravity of his discovery. He wasn't an educated man, but he understood enough to know this chest represented evidence of something terrible. He carefully reburied the container, marked the spot with some specifically arranged stones, and hurried to Pineville to find Sheriff Butler. Butler examined the trunk the next morning, accompanied by 2 deputies, and Whitfield himself. The discovery confirmed his darkest suspicions about the Henley sisters. Now he had physical evidence linking the disappearances to the area near the cabin, but he still needed more information before making any move against 2 citizens with a respectable community reputation. The sheriff decided to conduct a broader investigation, discreetly speaking with people who had had contact with the sisters over the years. That's how he uncovered unsettling details about the Henley family history. Sarah and Martha weren't Kentucky natives. They had arrived in the area about 10 years earlier, supposedly from Tennessee, after the death of the brother who left them the property. But when Butler sent a letter to Tennessee authorities requesting information on the Henley family, the response was baffling. There were no records of any family by that name in the region the sisters claimed to be from. Furthermore, Harlan County property records showed the land the cabin stood on had been purchased by 2 women identifying themselves with different names 10 years prior. This discovery led Butler to question everything he knew about the sisters. Who were these women really? Where did they come from? And why had they assumed false identities when settling in Kentucky? The answers seemed connected to a series of mysterious disappearances that had occurred in Tennessee approximately 10 years earlier in a region near the Kentucky border. Butler learned through correspondence with Tennessee authorities that a similar inn had operated near Nashville between 1830 and 1832. It was run by 2 women who offered lodging and meals to travelers. During that period, there were reports of at least 8 men who disappeared after being last seen in that region. The investigation at the time was limited due to a lack of hard evidence, and the 2 women running the inn suddenly vanished before authorities could properly question them. The connection between the Tennessee cases and the Kentucky disappearances seemed evident. The Henley sisters had developed a method they repeated wherever they settled. They chose strategic locations on travel routes, built a reputation for hospitality, and then carefully selected their victims from among solo travelers who wouldn't be immediately sought. But Butler still faced a problem. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, wouldn't be sufficient for a trial. He needed more direct proof, and that meant investigating the sisters' property more thoroughly. However, doing so without alerting them would be extremely difficult, given the hut's secluded location, where any suspicious movement would be easily noticed. It was then the sheriff had a risky idea. He knew a young deputy who had just arrived in the county named Daniel Hayes, unknown to the sisters. Hayes could pose as an ordinary traveler and stay at the cabin, closely observing the women's activities and searching for more concrete evidence. It was a dangerous plan, but Butler felt he had no other options if he wanted to solve the case before more people disappeared. Daniel Hayes was a 26-year-old who had arrived in Harlan County just 3 months earlier from the plains of western Kentucky. He had limited investigative experience, but he possessed 2 qualities essential for Butler's planned mission: courage and the appearance of an ordinary traveler. Tall, thin, in simple clothes, with the reserved manner typical of those seeking opportunities in a strange land. The plan was seemingly simple. Hayes would present himself as a seed trader coming from Louisville, heading to the eastern mining communities. He would bring a small sample of goods to lend credence to his story and arrive at the sisters' hut in the late afternoon as daylight faded and any sensible traveler sought shelter for the night. Butler instructed Hayes to discreetly observe everything: the cabin's room layout, the sisters' movements during the night, any unusual sounds or activity that might indicate where they were hiding evidence of the crimes. Most importantly, Hayes was to pay attention to the food served to him and try to identify the source of the meat the sisters seemed to have in constant abundance. On the morning of November 22, 1843, Hayes set out from Pineville on a borrowed horse, carrying a bundle of clothes and a small collection of seeds in cloth bags. He had memorized a detailed backstory about his supposed origin and destination, creating a convincing character to explain his presence in that isolated mountain region. The young deputy arrived at the Henley sisters' estate just before sunset, as the long shadows of the pine trees began to engulf the clearing where the cabin stood. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and the yellowish light from the windows created that welcoming atmosphere that had attracted so many travelers over the years. Sarah Henley answered the door with the same discreet smile described by other guests. She was indeed a tall, thin woman, with gray hair pulled back into a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to assess Hayes more intensely than normal for a simple guest reception. She invited him in with polite gestures, asking about his journey and offering him a seat at the table. Martha Henley then appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She was shorter and more robust than her sister, with less defined features and a way of moving that suggested considerable physical strength. She greeted Hayes with a nod and immediately returned to her business, leaving Sarah in charge of conversing with the visitor. The cabin's interior matched the descriptions Hayes had heard. The main room had the long oak table, a few simple chairs, a stone fireplace with a comforting fire crackling. There were doors leading to the guest bedrooms at the back and an entrance to the kitchen from which intense aromas of cooking food emanated. The walls were decorated with simple objects, typical of a rural home, but Hayes noticed some details that seemed strange to him. Hanging on one wall were several pocket watches of different styles, like trophies or souvenirs. On a shelf near the fireplace, a collection of rings and small personal effects was arranged in an apparently decorative manner, but one that suggested a more sinister origin. Hayes recognized some of the items from descriptions Butler had provided, based on the contents of the buried chest. During dinner, the sisters served exactly the kind of meal that had made their inn famous: a hearty stew with generous chunks of meat, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and vegetables that looked freshly harvested despite the late season. The meat had a distinctive flavor Hayes couldn't identify, seasoned with herbs that created a combination both familiar and unsettling. Hayes tried to strike up a conversation about the food's origin, asking if the sisters raised livestock on the property. Sarah replied vaguely, mentioning arrangements with local farmers and that they always managed to get the best cuts. When Hayes asked about hunting in the region, Martha looked at him with a strange expression, before muttering that the forest always provides what is needed. As the night progressed, Hayes began noticing behavior that confirmed his suspicions. The sisters whispered to each other, using words he couldn't fully understand. They seemed to be assessing something about him, exchanging meaningful glances when they thought he wasn't paying attention. After Hayes retired to the small room assigned to him, he pretended to fall asleep while keeping his senses alert for any unusual activity. He didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, he began hearing noises from somewhere on the property, noises suggesting intense physical activity, as if someone was digging or moving heavy objects. Hayes waited until he was sure the sisters were busy with whatever they were doing outside, then carefully got up and approached his bedroom window. The moon was nearly full that night, providing enough light to see part of the yard behind the cabin. What he saw there made him freeze and confirmed his worst fears about what was really happening at this isolated property in the Kentucky mountains. Through the fogged window of his room, Hayes could make out the silhouettes of the two sisters working in an area behind the cabin that during the day had looked like an ordinary garden. But now, under the moonlight, something completely different was revealed. What he had mistaken for vegetable beds were actually small mounds of fresh soil arranged in neat rows, like makeshift graves. Sarah and Martha worked in silence, moving with the efficiency of people who had repeated this activity many times. One held a tool that looked like a shovel, while the other carried something wrapped in a dark tarp. Hayes felt his heart race as he understood the sinister nature of what he was witnessing. This was no ordinary garden, but a clandestine cemetery where the sisters buried evidence of their crimes. The young deputy remained motionless by the window, mentally recording every detail. He counted at least 8 earth mounds that appeared to be recent graves scattered in an area stretching to the tree line. The site's organization suggested a method developed over years, with each grave discreetly marked by stones or small branches arranged in a specific way. Hayes watched the sisters work for nearly an hour until they finally went back inside the cabin. He waited a few more minutes before moving from the window, processing what he had seen and planning how to report his discovery to Sheriff Butler. But first, he needed to survive the rest of the night and leave the property without raising suspicion. The next morning, Hayes got up early and prepared to leave, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary traveler eager to continue his journey. Sarah Henley served him a simple breakfast of bread, butter, and slices of cold meat, with the same distinctive flavor as the previous night's meal. Throughout the morning conversation, Hayes had the impression the sisters were evaluating something about him, as if making an important decision. When it was time to leave, Martha appeared in the main room carrying a bundle she said contained provisions for the road. It was a seemingly kind gesture, typical of rural hospitality, but Hayes noticed the woman held the package strangely, as if it contained something other than food. He thanked her politely, put the bundle with his luggage, and headed to the stable where he had left his horse. While preparing the animal for the trip, Hayes noticed Sarah watching him from the cabin door with an unreadable expression. There was something predatory in that gaze, as if she was calculating distances and possibilities. He waved goodbye, mounted his horse, and rode away from the property at what he hoped seemed like a normal pace for someone with a long day of travel ahead. But as soon as he was out of sight of the cabin, Hayes spurred the horse and galloped towards Pineville at full speed. He had a feeling his life depended on reaching the authorities before the sisters realized he had discovered their secrets. The bundle Martha had given him bounced in his luggage, and he began suspecting its contents weren't what the sisters claimed. When he finally arrived at Sheriff Butler's office, Hayes was visibly shaken. He reported everything he had seen during the night, describing the clandestine cemetery and the sisters' suspicious activities. Butler listened with increasing gravity, realizing he finally had enough evidence for direct action against the women. But there was a problem. The sisters' property was under a neighboring county's jurisdiction, and Butler needed to coordinate with neighboring authorities to organize a proper search operation. Furthermore, the sisters might try to flee if they realized they were under investigation, repeating the pattern they had followed in Tennessee years earlier. Butler decided to act quickly. He organized a group of 6 men, including 2 experienced deputies and 4 local citizens, known for their courage and discretion. The plan was to surround the property in the early morning hours, when the sisters would be sleeping, and conduct a thorough search of the grounds for evidence of the crimes. As preparations were made, Hayes remembered the bundle from the sisters. When he opened it before Butler and the others, they found it contained not just ordinary provisions. Along with a few pieces of bread and dried meat was a small jar of dark liquid smelling of medicinal herbs, but which could easily be something more sinister. The vial's discovery reinforced suspicions that the sisters had specific methods to incapacitate their victims before eliminating them. It was possible they added substances to the meals served to guests, making them vulnerable and unable to resist or flee when the time came. Hayes began realizing how close he had come to being another victim of the Henley sisters. With all evidence gathered, Butler scheduled the operation for the next morning. It would be a dangerous mission facing 2 women shown to be capable of brutal crimes over the years. But it was the only way to stop a series of killings that had terrorized the region for too long and threatened to continue indefinitely if the sisters weren't arrested. The operation began before dawn on November 24, 1843. Butler and his men set out from Pineville in the dark, riding silently along trails winding through the mist-covered mountains. The biting cold of late November made the air dense, each breath forming small vapor clouds that dissipated quickly in the icy atmosphere. The group split near the sisters' property. Butler, Hayes, and 2 deputies would position themselves at the main entrance, while the other 4 men would surround the rear of the cabin where Hayes had seen the clandestine cemetery the night before. The goal was to prevent any escape attempts and ensure the sisters had no time to destroy evidence before capture. As the first sunlight filtered through the pine canopy, Butler and his men approached the cabin. The property was eerily quiet for that time of morning. No smoke came from the chimney. No signs of normal morning activity in a rural house. It was as if the hut was abandoned, even though horses were still in the stable, and there was no sign of recent departure. Butler knocked authoritatively on the main door, identifying himself as sheriff and demanding the sisters come out to answer questions. The silence that followed was disturbing. He repeated the call louder, but still no response came from inside. After a few minutes, Butler decided to force entry, fearing the sisters had fled during the night or were destroying evidence at that moment. The door wasn't locked, unusual given the property's secluded nature. Butler entered first, followed by the others, all with weapons ready for any eventuality. The cabin's interior was in disarray, as if someone had left in a hurry. Furniture was overturned, drawers opened, with clear signs belongings had been hastily collected. In the kitchen, the men found even more disturbing evidence. On the table were several jars with unidentified substances, knives of various sizes that didn't look like common cooking tools, and handwritten recipes containing suspicious ingredients. A large iron pot still held remnants of something recently cooked, emitting an aroma none of the men could identify, but all found deeply unpleasant. Hayes found in a kitchen drawer a collection of letters and documents, seemingly taken from different people's belongings. There was correspondence addressed to the missing men, employment contracts, even wills that never reached their final destination. It was as if the sisters kept trophies from each victim, preserving tangible memories of their crimes. But the most shocking discovery came when the men surrounding the rear began digging at the site Hayes had identified as a cemetery. The earth was loose and damp, making work easier, and they soon found the first remains. It was exactly what everyone feared, but seeing physical confirmation of the crimes made the situation even darker. Butler realized the sisters had fled during the night, probably realizing their operation had been discovered. They might have noticed something suspicious in Hayes's behavior during his visit, or informants in the local community had alerted them to the investigation. In any case, they had escaped again, following the same pattern as in Tennessee years earlier. The property search continued throughout the day, revealing the full extent of the Henley sisters' crimes. The men found 9 bodies buried in the clandestine cemetery, all in different stages of decomposition, suggesting the killings had occurred over approximately 2 years. Among the victims were the men reported missing, confirming the suspicions that motivated the investigation. In a smaller cabin at the property's rear, unnoticed during previous visits, investigators found what appeared to be a makeshift butcher shop. Hooks hung from the ceiling, wooden tables stained with dark substances, and tools clearly not intended for preparing common animal meat. The discovery explained how the sisters maintained a steady supply of fresh meat, even during the harshest winter periods. Butler realized he was facing one of the most disturbing cases of his career. The Henley sisters weren't simply ordinary killers, but systematic predators who had developed an elaborate method to lure, eliminate, and conceal their victims. The inn was just a front for far more sinister operations, and the reputation for good food they built in the community had an origin no one could have imagined. With the evidence collected and bodies recovered, Butler organized an intensive search for the runaway sisters. Alerts were sent to neighboring counties, and detailed descriptions of Sarah and Martha were distributed to officials throughout Kentucky and adjacent states. But Butler knew from previous Tennessee experience that the sisters were adept at assuming new identities and disappearing into remote regions where they could resume their criminal activities. News of the crimes discovered at the Henley sisters' estate spread through the Kentucky mountains like wildfire. Within days, the entire region knew the macabre details of what happened in that hut so many travelers considered a safe haven. Families living isolated in the mountains began locking their doors more carefully, and merchants started traveling in groups when possible. The local Pineville newspaper, the Mountain Herald, published a special edition devoted entirely to the case. The editor, a man named Samuel Morrison, ironically sharing a name with one of the victims, described the discovery as the most heinous crime ever documented in the Kentucky mountains. The story detailed Butler's investigation, the evidence found on the property, and included sketch portraits of the runaway sisters based on descriptions from Hayes and other guests who survived their stays at the cabin. However, the publicity also brought unexpected revelations. After the newspaper circulated, several people came forward with information they had kept to themselves for years. A farmer from a neighboring county said he had noticed a strange smell coming from the direction of the sisters' property on certain windy nights. An aroma he described as burning flesh mixed with something sweet and cloying. An elderly woman living in a cabin a few miles away reported seeing dark smoke rising from the property at unusual times, always in the early hours. Even more disturbing was the testimony of a 12-year-old boy who occasionally delivered supplies to the sisters. He said Sarah always greeted him at the property entrance, never allowing him to approach the main cabin. On 2 occasions, the boy had heard strange noises from the back of the property, as if someone was hammering wood or digging holes. When he asked about the sounds, Sarah explained they were tending the garden, but the boy noted he had never seen evidence of cultivation in the area where the noises came from. Butler organized a task force, including deputies from 3 different counties, to search for the runaway sisters. The investigation revealed they had left the property mounted on 2 horses, kept hidden in a nearby forest area, probably as an escape route prepared for emergencies. The animals' tracks were followed for about 15 miles northeast, but were lost in a rocky region where tracing footprints was impossible. Meanwhile, Butler continued investigating the sisters' past, trying to discover their true identities and origins. Through correspondence with officials in other states, he discovered a pattern extending far beyond Kentucky and Tennessee. There were similar reports of inns run by 2 women in at least 4 different states, always following the same pattern. Establishment on isolated travel routes, reputations for good food, mysterious disappearances of solo travelers. The earliest case Butler could document occurred in Virginia in 1828. An inn near the Blue Ridge Mountains had been investigated after a series of disappearances, but the 2 women running it disappeared before conclusive evidence could be found. Physical descriptions of the women roughly matched the Henley sisters, considering natural aging over the years. If the connections were correct, Sarah and Martha had operated for at least 15 years, moving from state to state whenever their activities began to arouse suspicion. It was a pattern of nomadic criminality, exploiting the limitations of communication and coordination between authorities in different jurisdictions. They had become specialized predators, refining their methods over the years until they developed a near-perfect system for attracting and eliminating victims. Butler estimated that over their entire criminal career, the sisters could have been responsible for more than 50 deaths. It was a shocking number, placing them among the most prolific criminals in American history up to that point. The fact they had operated so long without capture demonstrated not only their cruelty, but also a calculating intelligence, making their capture all the more urgent. The investigation also revealed aspects of how the sisters selected their victims. Analyzing belongings found on the property and bodies recovered from the clandestine cemetery, Butler realized all victims were young men traveling alone, usually carrying some money or valuables. The sisters seemed to carefully evaluate each guest, choosing only those who wouldn't be immediately sought and who could provide both financial resources and the ingredients needed to maintain their sinister operation. But one aspect of the case kept troubling Butler deeply. During the property search, his men found notebooks with detailed notes on each victim. The sisters kept meticulous records, including not only basic information like name and age, but also observations about personality, fears, and last words of each person they eliminated. It was as if they were conducting a macabre study of human behavior in times of despair. The notebooks revealed the sisters had considerable knowledge of herbs and substances that could incapacitate or poison people. Some notes suggested they experimented with different methods, as if perfecting techniques over time. There were also detailed drawings of the property showing alternative escape routes and locations where evidence could be quickly concealed if necessary. With all these discoveries, Butler understood he wasn't dealing with ordinary criminals, but with women who had dedicated their lives to developing sophisticated murder methods. Their capture had become not only a matter of local justice, but an urgent necessity to protect travelers throughout the Appalachian region. 3 weeks after the crimes were discovered at the Henley sisters' estate, Butler received a letter completely changing the investigation's course. The mail arrived via a courier who had ridden for 2 days from Pike County, an even more isolated mountainous region east of Harlan. The sender was local Sheriff Thomas Caldwell, writing about a situation seemingly directly connected to the runaway sisters case. Caldwell reported that 2 women matching Sarah and Martha's descriptions had appeared in his jurisdiction about a week earlier, presenting themselves as widows looking to start their lives over. They had bought a small, isolated property near the Virginia border, paying cash and showing unusual haste to complete the transaction. What caught local authorities' attention were rumors circulating about the new residents' strange behavior. Distant neighbors reported suspicious nighttime activity at the women's new property. Lights moving through the forest at dawn, digging noises, and the aroma of something burning at unusual times. Even more worrying was that a young trader had disappeared in the region just 3 days after the women arrived. The boy was last seen in a local tavern, mentioning he planned to seek shelter for the night, in a hut he had discovered during his trip. Butler immediately realized the sisters had resumed their criminal activities in a new location, following exactly the same pattern used in Kentucky, Tennessee, and other states over the years. But this time, there was a crucial difference. The authorities were alert and had detailed knowledge of their methods. It was a unique opportunity to capture them before they could fully establish their new operation. The sheriff quickly organized an expedition to Pike County, taking Hayes and 3 experienced deputies. The journey through the mountains would be dangerous, especially since the sisters now knew they were being sought and had likely prepared defenses for their new property. But Butler felt it was his last chance to catch criminals who had evaded justice far too long. The journey to Pike lasted 2 full days, riding narrow trails winding between rocky cliffs and dense forests. The group made only one rest stop at a small community called Breaks, where they confirmed 2 women matching the sisters' descriptions had indeed stopped recently, buying supplies and asking about isolated properties for sale. When they finally arrived in Sheriff Caldwell's territory, Butler was briefed on the local situation. The property the sisters purchased was in an extremely secluded area, accessible only by a narrow trail climbing a pine-covered mountainside. It was a defensible location with good visibility and multiple escape routes through the dense forest stretching to the Virginia border. Caldwell had conducted a discreet investigation into the missing young man, confirming his suspicions were correct. The merchant, a 23-year-old named Edward Collins, had indeed visited the sisters' property the night he disappeared. A farmer living a few miles away had seen smoke rising from the area all that night, much more intense than normal for ordinary household activities. Butler and Caldwell developed a careful plan to approach the sisters' estate. Unlike the previous Kentucky operation, this time they knew exactly who they were dealing with and could prepare accordingly. The group would be larger, including 8 armed men, and the approach would be made during daylight for better visibility, giving the sisters fewer opportunities to use darkness to their advantage. But there were complications. The property was technically under shared Kentucky and Virginia jurisdiction. Due to the imprecise state boundaries in that mountainous region, any operation needed careful coordination to avoid further legal problems. Additionally, the sisters had demonstrated a remarkable ability to escape when threatened over the years, and it was likely they had prepared escape routes even at their new location. The night before the planned operation, Butler reviewed everything he knew about the sisters and their methods. They were experienced criminals who had operated successfully for over 15 years, constantly adapting to new circumstances and always staying one step ahead of authorities. Capturing them would require not only courage and determination, but also a strategy accounting for their intelligence and resources. Hayes, who had survived the previous encounter, offered valuable insights into their behavior and their former property's layout. He suggested approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent escape through routes the sisters had probably prepared. He also recommended extreme caution with any food or drink found on the property. Considering the sisters' knowledge of toxic substances, the operation was scheduled for dawn. Butler knew it would be the most dangerous confrontation of his career, facing criminals who had dedicated their lives to systematic murder. But he also knew it was the only way to ensure no one else became a victim of the Henley sisters, whatever their real names were. Justice had been delayed too long, and the time had come for a final reckoning in the shadowy Appalachians. The dawn of December 15th, 1843, brought a dense fog covering Pike County's mountains like a ghostly blanket. Butler and his men positioned themselves before sunrise, strategically distributed around the sisters' acquired property. The new cabin was on a natural elevation, offering a wide view of the surrounding valleys, but also making it vulnerable to a well-coordinated siege. Unlike the previous Kentucky property, this new location showed signs of defensive preparation. The sisters had felled trees to create clear fields of vision, built makeshift log barriers, and apparently dug shallow trenches around the hut. It was clear they expected to be found eventually, and had prepared for confrontation. Butler divided his men into 3 groups. He would lead the front approach with 3 deputies. Caldwell would surround the property from the west with 2 local men, and Hayes would block the most likely eastern escape route with 2 other volunteers who knew the region well. The goal was to force the sisters to surrender, or at least prevent them from escaping again. As the first sunlight began clearing the fog, Butler advanced toward the cabin. Unlike the previous operation, this time he shouted his identification from a safe distance, demanding the sisters come out with hands visible to answer the charges. The answer came as a rifle shot, passing close enough to his head that he heard the bullet whistle through the air. It was evident the sisters didn't intend to surrender peacefully. Butler and his men took cover behind trees and rocks, returning fire in a controlled manner. The ensuing shooting was intense, but brief, with the sisters showing surprisingly accurate aim for middle-aged women. They clearly had firearm experience, another skill developed during years of criminal life. During a lull, Butler heard voices from the cabin. The sisters were talking urgently, apparently discussing options. He used the moment to shout a proposal. If they surrendered voluntarily, they would be treated according to the law and have a fair trial. If they continued resisting, he couldn't guarantee their safety when the situation was resolved by force. Sarah Henley's answer echoed through the mountains with unsettling clarity. She shouted back, they would rather die in those mountains than spend their lives in prison. Even more disturbing was Martha adding, they had already lived longer than most people could bear, and their labors were almost complete. The words had a tone of finality, making Butler understand. The sisters had plans beyond simple resistance. It was then Hayes, positioned on the eastern escape route, noticed smoke beginning to rise from the cabin. It wasn't normal fireplace smoke, but something denser and darker, as if materials were being burned intentionally. Butler realized the sisters were destroying evidence, possibly including documents revealing the full extent of their crimes over the years. The sheriff made a risky decision. He ordered his men to advance simultaneously from all directions, taking advantage of the sisters' distraction with burning materials. It was a dangerous maneuver, exposing them to enemy fire. But evidence destruction could jeopardize any future trial and leave important questions about other crimes unanswered. The coordinated attack took the sisters by surprise. Butler and Caldwell reached the cabin almost simultaneously, while Hayes effectively blocked escape attempts. But when they forced entry, they discovered a scene neither was prepared to face. Sarah and Martha had barricaded the main door and were in the room's center, surrounded by piles of burning documents. They held large knives like those Butler had seen at the previous property, their faces showing determination bordering on fanaticism. These were no longer the discreet women offering traveler hospitality, but something far more primitive and dangerous. The final confrontation lasted only seconds, but seemed an eternity. Sarah lunged at Butler with a raised knife, forcing him to use his gun in self-defense. Martha tried to flee through a side window, but was intercepted by Caldwell. In the ensuing chaos, the documents kept burning, filling the hut with thick smoke, making it hard to see and breathe. When the smoke cleared and the situation stabilized, Butler looked around the devastated cabin. Some evidence had been saved, but clearly the sisters had managed to destroy important information about their activities. Still, there was enough material to confirm his suspicions about the crime's extent and begin building a more complete picture of 2 decades of systematic killings. Among documents surviving the flames, Butler found detailed maps of travel routes in multiple states, lists of names apparently corresponding to victims, and correspondence with people who might have been accomplices or informants about lone travelers. Detailed recipes for preparing toxic substances using local plants were also found, confirming suspicions about how the sisters incapacitated their victims. But the most disturbing discovery was a personal diary Martha had kept over the years. The entries revealed a completely twisted mindset, where the murders were justified as a form of cleansing society, and the travelers were seen as offerings for some greater purpose she never clearly explained. It was the mind of a woman who had completely lost any connection with normal humanity. In the days following the sisters' capture, Butler devoted himself to meticulously examining the fragments of evidence that survived the cabin fire. Working with Caldwell and other investigators, he partially reconstructed the chronology of the sisters' crimes over more than 2 decades. What emerged was an even darker picture than anyone had imagined. Martha's diary, though fire-damaged, contained entries dating back to 1825. The first legible pages suggested the sisters began their criminal activities in North Carolina, in a mountainous region near the Tennessee border. Initially, they seemed to have acted out of necessity, eliminating travelers to steal their belongings and money. But over time, the motivation evolved into something much more disturbing. The most recent diary entries revealed Martha saw her crimes as part of an elaborate ritual. She wrote about feeding the earth with human offerings and how each victim contributed to a greater purpose she believed she was fulfilling. There were references to dreams and visions guiding her victim selection, and detailed descriptions of how she prepared bodies before burying them in her clandestine cemeteries. Sarah, for her part, appeared to be the practical mind behind the operation. Documents in her handwriting showed meticulous planning of location changes, careful analysis of lucrative travel routes, and even studies of different traveler habits. She had turned murder into a science, developing increasingly efficient methods. During the interrogations following their capture, the sisters displayed completely different personalities. Martha remained silent most of the time, occasionally muttering incomprehensible phrases about mountain voices and unfinished work. When she spoke clearly, it was to express disappointment at not completing the required number before capture. Sarah, in contrast, maintained a cold, calculating composure even in prison. She answered questions evasively, never directly admitting to the crimes, but making clear she considered her actions justified. On one memorable occasion, she told Butler that people traveling alone in the mountains are searching for something, and they simply offered what they needed to find. The investigation revealed the sisters had used at least 6 different identities over the years. The names Sarah and Martha Henley were just the latest in a long list of aliases, including combinations like Mary and Elizabeth Turner, Catherine and Margaret Bailey, and Rebecca and Anne Coleman. Each identity change coincided with a location change, always following the same pattern of establishing inns on isolated travel routes. Butler mapped at least 8 different locations where the sisters had operated between 1825 and 1843. North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, and possibly other states that couldn't be confirmed due to document destruction. In each location, there were reports of mysterious traveler disappearances, always matching the same profile. Young men traveling alone, carrying money or valuables. The conservative estimate was that the sisters murdered between 50 and 70 people during their criminal career. But the numbers could be higher, considering periods without adequate documentation. This scale of criminality surprised even seasoned investigators, making the sisters among the most prolific killers in American history up to that point. What made their crimes even more shocking was the cold, systematic methodology they developed. They didn't act on impulse or passion, but as calculating predators who turned murder into a business. Every operational aspect was carefully planned, from location selection to body disposal and selling victims' belongings. Butler discovered the sisters maintained a contact network, helping them sell items stolen from victims. Merchants in distant cities bought watches, jewelry, and other valuables without questioning their provenance. Some transactions were documented in papers surviving the fire, providing clues about a wider network of people who, knowingly or not, facilitated the sisters' crimes. Preparation for the sisters' trial became a regional event. Journalists from big cities like Louisville and Nashville traveled to Pike County to cover what was called the trial of the century in the Appalachian Mountains. The nature of the crimes and the length of the sisters' criminal career captured public imagination in a way few criminal cases could. But significant legal complications arose because the crimes occurred in multiple states over many years, making determining the appropriate trial jurisdiction a complex challenge. Prosecutors from different states claimed the right to prosecute the sisters, each arguing their specific cases had priority. Eventually, it was decided the trial would be held in Kentucky, where the most recent crimes were committed and where the most physical evidence was available. But it was understood that regardless of that trial's outcome, the sisters would face additional charges in other states if found guilty. As the trial date approached, Butler reflected on the case's impact on the region. The discovery of the sisters' crimes fundamentally changed how people viewed rural mountain hospitality. The tradition of entertaining strangers, a defining feature of Appalachian culture, was now viewed with suspicion and caution. It was a significant cultural loss, an erosion of trust that would take generations to repair. Sarah and Martha's trial began in March 1844 at the Harlan County Courthouse, a small wooden building barely accommodating the number of people interested in the case. Journalists, onlookers, and victims' relatives traveled from distant states to witness what many considered the most important criminal trial of the decade in the Appalachian Mountains. The prosecutor, an experienced attorney named William Harrison, brought in specially from Frankfurt for the case, built his indictment on physical evidence found at the sisters' properties and testimony from witnesses who survived encounters with them. The strategy was to present a clear pattern of criminal behavior spanning decades, demonstrating premeditation and systematic cruelty. During the trial's initial phase, Harrison called Daniel Hayes as a star witness. The young deputy recounted in detail his experience infiltrating the sisters' hut, describing what he saw through the window at night and the evidence observed inside the house. His testimony was crucial in establishing the connection between the sisters and the crimes discovered later. Thomas Whitfield, the worker who found the trunk buried with victims' belongings, also testified. He described the discovery that started the investigation, showing the jury some recovered objects belonging to the missing men. The physical evidence presentation visibly impacted the jurors, many seeming disturbed by the crime's systematic nature. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Harrison presented Martha's diary to the jury. He read aloud some excerpts surviving the fire, revealing the disturbed mentality behind the murders. Martha's descriptions of offerings to the land and higher purposes caused murmurs of horror in the courtroom, demonstrating the crimes involved not just greed, but profound mental imbalance. The The sisters' defense was conducted by two local lawyers facing a nearly impossible case. Their primary strategy was questioning the evidence's reliability, arguing many documents were fire-damaged and the prosecution's interpretations were speculative. They also attempted to use Martha's apparent mental imbalance as the basis for an insanity defense. But the defense faced the problem that the sisters refused to cooperate fully. Sarah maintained her cool, calculating demeanor, answering her own lawyer's questions with evasive responses that harmed her cause more than helped. Martha, for her part, occasionally interrupted proceedings with incomprehensible outbursts about voices in the mountains and unfinished work. During Sarah's testimony, she demonstrated detailed knowledge of laws and legal procedures that surprised everyone in the courtroom. It was clear she had studied the judicial system for years, probably preparing for eventual capture. When questioned about the killings, she didn't directly deny involvement, but insisted her actions were necessary to maintain the mountain's natural balance. The trial revealed additional details about the sisters' methods not discovered during the initial investigation. Witnesses who had known the sisters under previous identities came forward, reporting suspicious behavior that now made sense in the context of the crimes. A Tennessee merchant testified about strange transactions where the sisters sold men's personal effects in unusual quantities. More disturbing was the testimony of a local doctor the sisters had consulted years earlier about certain medicinal plants' properties. He revealed they had demonstrated advanced knowledge of botanical toxicology, asking specific questions about lethal dosages and poisoning symptoms. At the time, he assumed they were interested in herbal medicine to help sick guests, but now he understood the true intentions behind their questions. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict for both sisters on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The decision's speed reflected the overwhelming force of the evidence presented and the horror the crimes had caused in the community. The judge, an elderly man named Samuel Porter, who had presided over criminal cases in the mountains for more than 20 years, described the crimes as the most heinous he had ever encountered in his career. The sentence was pronounced the next morning. Both sisters were sentenced to death by hanging, a decision met with quiet approval by the crowd packing the courtroom. Sarah listened to the sentence without showing emotion, maintaining the same cold expression that had characterized the entire trial. Martha, on the other hand, began laughing disturbingly, muttering something about finally being able to join the voices in the mountains. But there was a final twist awaiting everyone involved in the case. The night before the scheduled execution, set for 2 weeks after sentencing, unexpected events at the local jail completely changed the outcome everyone expected. What happened that night became as mysterious as the very crimes that had brought the sisters to court. The night guard, a reliable man with over 10 years of service, was found the next morning in a condition no one could fully explain. He was alive, but seemed to have undergone an experience leaving him in a state of deep shock. When he finally managed to speak, his words were as disturbing as they were incomprehensible. He talked about conversations he overheard between the sisters during the night, even though they were in separate cells and shouldn't have been able to communicate. He described sounds from the cells that didn't seem completely human, and strange lights he swore he saw moving through the prison corridors. Even more unsettling, he insisted the voices he heard included people he knew had been dead for years. On the morning of the scheduled execution, Butler arrived at the local jail to discover a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cells meant to hold Sarah and Martha were empty, but there were no signs of escape or break-in. The doors remained locked from the outside. The barred windows were intact, and there were no tunnels or secret passages to explain the sisters' disappearance. The jailer, still in shock from the previous night's events, could only repeat fragments of his experience. He swore he heard the sisters talking all night, not only to each other, but with voices seeming to come from beyond the prison walls. According to his account, the conversations included names of people he recognized as murder victims, as if the dead had returned for a final meeting. About 2 hours before dawn, the jailer said absolute silence fell over the prison. It was a silence so deep he could hear his own heartbeat. When he finally mustered the courage to check the cells, he found only clothes neatly folded on the bunks, as if the sisters had simply stripped naked and vanished. Butler organized the largest search in the region's history, mobilizing men from 4 different counties to find the runaway sisters. Tracking dogs were brought from Louisville, but they lost any scent just a few feet from the prison, as if the sisters had dissolved into the morning air. The search lasted 3 weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of mountainous territory, but revealing no sign of the women. As days passed without discoveries, strange stories began circulating among regional residents. Travelers reported seeing 2 female figures walking trails during the full moon, always fading when approached. Farmers told of animals acting agitated on certain nights, as if noticing invisible presences nearby. More disturbing were reports from people claiming to have met the sisters in dreams. These experiences always followed the same pattern. The sisters would appear offering tempting meals, but when the person tried to eat, they would wake with a bitter taste and the feeling of having narrowly escaped something terrible. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that some began believing the sisters had found a way to continue their activities even after death. The case of the Appalachian sisters was never officially closed. In Harlan County files, it remains listed as an unexplained disappearance, a classification that frustrated Butler until the end of his career. Over the following years, there were sporadic reports of similar crimes in distant mountainous regions, but never enough evidence to confirm the sisters' involvement. The case's lasting impact extended far beyond its region. The sisters' story became an Appalachian legend, passed down generations as a warning about the dangers of relying too much on stranger hospitality. Rural inns across the region began operating differently, with increased guest scrutiny and closer cooperation with local authorities. Daniel Hayes, who had risked his life to expose the sisters' crimes, could never completely forget his experience. He continued working as a deputy for many years, but always reported difficulty sleeping on full moon nights. In his personal records, he wrote that he sometimes still tasted the strange meat from the sisters' hut, as if the flavor was permanently etched in his memory. The sisters' original Harlan County property was never reoccupied. The cabin was left to rot, and over time the forest reclaimed the clearing. Hunters and travelers passing through reported a constant feeling of being watched, especially near the former clandestine cemetery. Some claimed to hear digging noises on certain nights, as if someone was still burying secrets in that cursed land. Thomas Whitfield, the man who made the initial buried chest discovery, moved to a distant town months after the trial. He never spoke publicly about his experience, but neighbors reported he developed a habit of avoiding any trails through isolated mountain areas. When asked about his sudden behavior change, he only muttered about certain lands that should remain undisturbed. The identified victims' relatives found little solace in the case's outcome. Although they had confirmation about their loved one's fate, the sisters' mysterious disappearance left many questions unanswered. Some expressed relief knowing the female killers could no longer claim new victims, while others remained plagued by a sense of incomplete justice. Sheriff Butler continued investigating similar cases until retirement, but never found conclusive evidence the sisters had survived and resumed their activities. In his later years, he often reflected on the case, wondering if he had overlooked details or clues that might have led to a different outcome. He died in 1868, taking to his grave the frustration of never fully solving the mystery of the sisters of the Appalachian Mountains. Today, over 180 years later, The sister's story stands as one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. It serves as a grim reminder that even in the most remote and seemingly peaceful places, human wickedness can flourish under the right conditions. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, but few are as haunted as the memory of two women who turned rural hospitality into a death trap. If you've made it this far on this journey through the mountain's dark secrets, leave in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Activate the bell so you don't miss our next investigations, and tell us which part of this story impressed you the most.